Are you the gatekeeper?
You better bring him inside.
Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Keepers of the Gate. Yeah! All right, guys, have fun. So I'm sure you've all seen or heard about this article published in Bloomberg City Lab about 2 weeks ago. And if you haven't, you really should seek it out because this slanderous piece of propaganda here succeeds on so many levels, right? And the first is, of course, that by being such a mainstream source, it single-handedly legitimized Tartaria as a conspiracy theory of record. I mean, Mudflood too, by association, though I don't believe them to be mutually exclusive or even related for that matter, but Tartaria might as well be Atlantis now that it's in the flat Earth stratosphere, right? All we need is for Joe Biden to drop a, it's not like this building is a mud flooder at some charity event in DC. That's how over Tartaria is poised to become, right? And don't let the whole QAnon business bother you either. I mean, that's more smoke over what they're really doing with this piece, this article here. And that's a lot more than just outing Tartaria, right? And in the end, may not have anything to do with Tartaria at all. And so from my perspective, there are at least 3 ways to look at this story. And I'm sure there are more, but I'm going to focus on 3 anyway, right? And the first is that this story confirms your bias that QAnon people are crazy, right? Because the primary focus of this story is how QAnon people are crazy conspiracy theorists. It's, super right-wing, white supremacist nonsense, right? And a primary focus of this article is to paint the QAnon culture in that light, But regardless of how you feel about QAnon or Tartaria or Mudflood or anything, you always have to keep in mind the sources. And so where is this article coming from? It's coming from Bloomberg, right? Bloomberg City Lab, right? And so, there's a whole lot to be said in just that alone, right? Because we cannot underestimate Bloomberg's connection to the Rockefeller Foundation, right? And the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, right? And its connection to the pandemic and everything that's going on today, right? This stuff can't be undersold, right? But of course this is from the City Lab. And so what was the City Lab? The City Lab is I guess it's a webzine or something like this that the central focus of is city life, urban culture, city culture, things like that, right? And so it says here that Bloomberg Media acquires City Lab from The Atlantic on December 10th, 2019. And so, of course, The Atlantic is a super well-established magazine, right? It's been around forever. Here it says 1857, right? The Atlantic has been pushing its culture out into the American public and beyond, for 170 years, 180 years or something like this, all right? And so when I was kind of like poking around there, it says that the parent company of Atlantic is this Emerson Collective. So I click on Emerson Collective, right? You have to do that, right? And it says that it was founded by Laurene Powell Jobs, right? So that is Steve Jobs' widow, right? She's worth $19 billion, right? And of course, she just so happens to be, and she's a major donor to the Democratic Party, including Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, right? She has all these philanthropic activities like City Labs and her Emerson Collective. But notice her maiden name of Powell, just like Jerome Powell, who sits at the chair of the Federal Reserve, just like the Powell that is really Poe of Edmund Bewley's Edgar Allan Poe biographies and the hidden bloodline of the Hand. And I mean, he just can't make this stuff up. It is unbelievable, right? And so, that's where this article is coming from. So much can be learned just in that alone as to, what the possible implications or intentions of this article could be. And so now you trust the source, you see what it's about, and it confirms your bias that that these QAnon people are crazy, right? Absolutely nuts. All right, but maybe you view it from the other side and you see this as a validation of the theory, right? That the Tartaria theory must be right because why say anything about it at all? Why legitimize it in this way? If I were a promoter of Tartaria, this is the tack that I would take. They must be scared if they're launching this kind of smear campaign against it, right? Look how right we are. They're finally recognizing it, they're putting it out there. We got them on the run. That's how I would start to be selling my content from here on out, because as the greatest showman once said, there's no such thing as bad publicity. And I would do everything I could do to milk that for all it's worth, because Tartaria could potentially pick up a lot of interest over this. I mean, maybe not, but it's certainly possible. Nice. and But if you're like me and invested in the idea of a false historical paradigm, but not invested in Tartaria at all, I mean, you might see the third way. And that's that all this attention proves that Tartaria has been a disinformation gatekeeping program this whole time, right? A red herring to distract from actually digging into and taking a hard look at the mainstream narrative. Like the way they confuse our history with our entertainment, trying to make them indistinguishable from one another, right? This is why it's important to tie Tartaria to the Q and far-right movement. Because Tartaria has what Peter Ditto here, where is he? Peter Ditto, a social psychologist at the University of California, Irvine, who specializes in conspiracy theories, right? He says that Tartaria shares QAnon's cafeteria quality. And I agree with him on this point here, that there really doesn't seem to be an overarching narrative or a single authorial voice interpreting these events, right? It is just a gusher of outlandish speculation, and I'm all for outlandish speculation, don't get me wrong, right? And that adherents to, QAnon and to Tartaria can pick and choose which elements they want to sign on to, right? And I definitely kind of agree with that assessment, just from what I've checked out about it, because as we all know, Tartaria and I, have our differences. And so I tend to agree with this assertion here, but I don't necessarily know if I agree that the satanic pedophile cabal, conspiracy theory crashed into the real world in 2020. Yeah, I think that one's been going on a while. I'm not sure what that's all about here, but... And so the trick here is that by tying Tartaria into the QAnon movement, right, what you're really doing is, because you associated the QAnon movement as an unfounded conspiracy theory. So by tying Tartaria and Q, the author is doing more than trying to discredit Tartaria. Because as he says next, right, the overall premise of Tartaria is an alternative history. So the logic would be, if Q is an unfounded conspiracy theory, then so too is Tartaria. And if Tartaria is alternative history, then alternative history is unfounded conspiracy theory. Right? By having Tartaria as an alternative history flagship, mainstream academics and media now have their escape route, right? You're just one of those crazy Tartarian believers, right? I mean, but what's really happening here is they found a way to discredit alternative history in its own right by associating it with Tartaria and QAnon. And the author here, he makes special mention of how most Q types are super anti-Semitic and racist. So now, if you question history at all, you're a white supremacist, right? I wonder what Bloomberg would make of channels like UBTV or Dane Calloway, right? Do you think they're QAnon? Are they white supremacists? Right? But if there's one thing we know, right? If there's any truth in these lies, it's that history is written by the winners, right? And by those who weren't there. Right? It's all alternative, right? It's impossible to know how many times this realm has been turned over. How many victors there have been. Our history could be millions of years old, or we could have just been created last week, for all I know, right? But, this being the Matrix and all, right? Everything being coded, right? But it seems to me that Tartaria is now just a way for the mainstream to discredit alternative history, which is an old game, Maybe now, like, thinking about it this way, maybe it's the oldest game, but... Right, so now I'm curious to see what, if anything, happens because of this. Right, because one element they use, of course, is all the old pictures of the great buildings, right? And this article is chock full of them, right? And, some of them fake. There's one that's clearly fake. Where is it? And this one, look at the poor cut and paste job on this one. Look at how that doesn't match at all. The grand detail here and then this fuzziness over here. What's that all about? But by making these grand old buildings the focus of some lost Tartarian empire, within this mud flood false history paradigm community, really kind of allowed me the freedom to go do the work that I needed to do with what I was seeing around Baltimore, and that was concentrating on some of the smaller, less grand examples of buildings that showed signs of being buried, or that they were bigger or taller buildings. Like the ones around Baltimore that had captured my imagination long before I ever heard of mud flood, right? Because I remember a mud flood before Tartaria, right? And this is from the first time I ever took photographs with the intention of creating a YouTube channel. And this was on August 30th, 2018, right? And it was these types of buildings that was capturing my attention all over Baltimore, right? Look at how high those stairs are. And what was the purpose of that? Especially this thing being built, I think it was in the 1880s is the date on this one. I can't quite remember. But there are things that drove me nuts all over the city, like this church here. This window goes all the way down almost like to the ground. This is a very tight, narrow alley back here. I can't remember the name of the video that I looked at this church in, but, these houses here were built like, 20 years before this church. So why does it make sense to how does it make sense to build a window here when it's not going to be able to serve the purpose that it was intended for, because these houses were already here? It drives me crazy. The descending windows. Here, this is actually Mount Clair, right? Underneath the steps. This house built in the 1760s. I don't know if we can see it in there. There's some weird action going on under the steps here. I can't quite see it right now myself, but there is. So I have some very real questions concerning this stuff, especially when I think about the amount of earth that I see moved all over the place. And I don't know if I have pictures brought up of some of that, but I bring it up often in my videos, like from Annapolis, and even looking around the rectory at the top of Cathedral Hill. I see it all over the place, how much earth has been moved out and what the original grade of Baltimore City must have been, right? And other areas that I go to as well. And so he uses these old photographs and, this Gilded Age architecture, to try to discredit the Tartarian Empire, and, talks about the buildings of, some of these buildings being built, as recently as the 1920s and so forth. But what gets me, of course, is the below grade windows, right? And that's what I want to talk about here real quick. And so, of course, not only going into all the grand buildings, the author goes into the below grade windows here. And so he says here that an abundance of posters appear convinced that below grade basement windows in older buildings, for example, are evidence that the building has been mud flooded and that the rest of the structure is actually buried deep underground. Right, sometimes this will get skeptical pushback, like I think they didn't have lights in the cellar, so they built in windows for them, was how one poster responded, right? And that's more of an exception than the rule. But, it reminded me of an incident that happened to me just almost 2 years ago, and how long I've actually been sitting on the video I wanted to make about that incident, which is almost 2 years. And so, this is my much ignored Baltimore Fats Facebook page, right? And on July 9th, 2019, I did this posting here, right? Love me some sunken Baltimore windows. Stick says these drop 2.5 feet below the sidewalk. Zillow says this building was built in 1920. You believe that, don't you? Right? And, so here's some pictures of it. But, I just wanted to point out like the side of the building. And I have a picture of one that I took this morning that I'm going to show too. All these uniform windows right along that match the full side of this building. There would have been 4 all the way across. All right. And I think this doorway, of course, was just a window was blown open. I talked about that early on in my show a lot. All right. And so in the comments section, this guy here, whose name I'm not going to say out loud, right? He took me to task, right? And he accused me of being a fraud, of peddling lies, and we got into it really good. And, and you're welcome to go read this. I only embarrass myself a little bit, but he actually embarrasses himself quite a bit, in my estimation. We get into it pretty good. And along the way, he kept telling me these below grade windows were all coal chutes. It was coal chutes, and I think he does mention light and ventilation along the way in there as well, but it's coal chutes. He must write coal chutes like 100, as many times as he calls me a fraud in this, he says coal chutes, I think. Right. And he said, in here, he says, you need to go to the library. You need to go do some research. Go to the library, look stuff up. And so the thing about that is that I actually did go to the library. Right? And so I asked to give me every city code book they could give me from 1800 to 1920. Right? And this is what they brought me. So obviously it's not every year. And, so they certainly didn't give me every year, but they gave me enough, right? They gave me this one, right? 1838. And I also think I have 1850, the binding. Yeah, 1850. I didn't take pictures of all the bindings. But what I did do was look up and take pictures of any reference to basements, cellars, windows, anything like that I could. And you know what I learned about below grade windows looking at the city codes of Baltimore City from as early as 1838 up to 1920?
Nothing! Absolutely nothing!
Hey, they don't say anything about below grade windows in here. And the reason I've been sitting on this for so long is because, it needs a lot more work. This was, I think I spent 2 hours at the library this day doing this, right? So really not any time at all. And, I was hoping to get to it by now, but obviously so many other stories have come up. But in the wake of this Tartarian exposure, and so now having done the history of Baltimore floods video and seeing all the stories of the flooded basements going back into the 1830s and earlier, and seeing that there's nothing about below grade windows or really much about basements or cellars at all in these city codes, is really amazing. And so something buried these houses and these streets in Baltimore, and that these houses and streets are a lot older than what our mainstream narrative tells us, and how do I know this? Because one day, a few months back, I found a construction crew digging this hole in the side of a street in my neighborhood, right? And so I started talking to the guys in the crew, and I asked them if they ever noticed or thought about the below grade windows, or if they ever found another road beneath the one that they were digging up. And one guy said that he did find a road when he did a job by Lexington Market. And so when I asked him how far down the road was, he said it was a good 5 feet. 5 feet! Right? So we have all these houses with rows of windows that I bet dollars to donuts. If you were to dig down 5 or 6 feet, that's probably the original first or ground level of a lot of these buildings and homes, right? We got floods in Baltimore that the National Weather Authority is hiding from us, right? We got a street 5 feet beneath Lexington Market. And we have an amazing story of the false history through the Mud City Paradigm Puzzle Tree, so no long lost empires need apply, right? The ones given me to work with are doing just fine, right? So, and remember, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies. All right, so until the next one, cheers, guys.